Good evening, everyone. My name is Adrienne Heron. I'm the KTT or the Living Labs lead for the knowledge translation and transfer for the Alberta Agrisystems Living Lab. I want to take a minute to acknowledge that the members of the Alberta Agrisystems Living Lab team are grateful to live, work, and be in relation with people from across many traditional territories covering all regions of Alberta. This acknowledgement is to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility to improving our relationships and our own understanding of local Indigenous people, their cultures, and their knowledge. I would like to thank Dr. Tim McAllister for kicking off our webinar series again this year. It's tradition. Tim does our first webinar the first Wednesday of November. That's 3 years running now. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Dr. McAllister grew up on his parents' cow-calf farm outside of Innisfail. He has longer than my arm of degrees and chairs and does many interesting things at the Lethbridge Research Station for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. He's going to talk to us tonight about optimizing our forage production. We're going to make every bale count, every load of silage count. So yeah, I think with that, I would say take it away, Tim. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Adrienne. I'll just share my screen here. We'll make sure that'll work.
Perfect.
Thanks, Adrienne. Yeah, so I thought I'd volunteer to give a presentation that I actually delivered parts of this presentation at a meeting in Florida earlier this year related to forage efficiency and maximizing the efficiency of forage production. So I'm not an agronomist, so I'm not going to really talk too much about how to specifically grow different types of forages, but I'm going to talk a little bit about optimizing the digestible dry matter yield, which if you're feeding that forage to ruminant animals, that's the ultimate objective that you want to achieve. So I'm going to talk a bit about a systems perspective. I think we need to continuously think about how forages fit into agricultural systems, whether it be a form of rotational crop that you include with part of your crop rotation, the impacts that it has in terms of promoting biodiversity and carbon sequestration, as well as things to consider with regard to how you handle the harvesting and management of the forage and the implications that it has on the amount of digestible dry matter that you end up producing at the end of the day. The importance of matching the forage with the environment, utilizing forage to optimize soil health, optimizing digestible dry matter yield, how you need to consider that as also continuing after you look at forage conservation, because any digestible dry matter that you lose after harvest represents a reduction in digestible dry matter yield. Matching the forage to the dietary needs of the animals, so ensuring that you're using the forage in the diet in the most optimal way possible and feeding the right forage to the right animal. And then the role of forage is also within a circular bioeconomy. So when we look at the pillars of agricultural sustainability, forages play a key role in terms of resource efficiency, profitability. We still export a significant quantity of forage as well out of Alberta, and particularly into Japanese, Korean, Chinese markets, and market access is important for that. Fortunately, I think we've been tariffed on that yet, but who knows, it could be coming. Soil health and water management and biodiversity conservation in terms of biodiversity of the microbes within the soil, the insects that are pollinators that are associated with the plants, and the larger mammals in that live within those forage-based ecosystems. And then the importance of food security, worker welfare, and community development, and the role that forages play in that. It's in terms of the grasslands and that we see when we drive across the country. So in terms of forages and their economic stability, we've got all the resources in that we put into it, whether it be the use of the land, the water, the labor, the fertilizers, the seeds, and occasionally the pesticides as well. What implication that has in terms of the resource matrix when you look at the soil and water, the production of the forage is the primary producer who focuses on producing them. Sometimes the primary producer of the forage is not the person that's feeding the livestock. So they may be a disconnect there if they're not thinking about the production of the forage from the perspective of the degree that it's going to benefit the livestock. And then, of course, if it's looking at markets for export markets to either locally or to internationally, the way they're using forage in many of those diets in the Pacific Rim countries is different than what we use here. So you're looking for a different forage type for that market as well. Forages are applied in both extensive and intensive systems, so we need to consider that. What system is the forage going to be used? What animals is it going to be fed to, whether it be cattle, goats, or horses, or dairy cows? And then the production that leads to in terms of the byproducts and the meat and that is used in terms of what comes back from the livestock itself. And then we have all these constraints where there be environmental constraints in terms of the availability of sunlight and water. Social constraints with the markets may impact that, and economic constraints as well in terms of prices and costs of production. So it's really important to match the forage to the environment. This is just some work that was done a few years back by mainly Karen Boschman was the one doing the work, where they were looking, there's a big emphasis in producing more corn in the prairie provinces, and basically corn is migrating north as the companies work towards developing and breeding for lines that require fewer heat units in order to grow. But you still have to match obviously the corn growing areas where there's the least amount of risks is where they can match the heat units. Once you start to move into more northern climates, then you become more dependent on weather consisting number of frost-free days staying long, and so the overall risk because of the possibility of frost and a dramatic reduction in the length of growing season can have a big impact on yield and energy value of the end product at the end of the day. Now, that's also going to make a difference in terms of going back to what animal you're feeding that to. If you're feeding that to a beef cow at maintenance, it's maybe not such an issue because she doesn't require a high level of energy or a high level of protein. But if you were feeding it to a dairy cow, then there'd be disadvantages of doing that with corn that was growing in that area. The dry matter yield of corn hybrids, this is the work where we looked at, so this just sort of illustrates that. And I think Vern Barron was involved in this work as well as Karen Boschman, where they showed that the yield average, whether you're in Lacombe, is on the low side with a maximum yield in a good year of up to 17.6 tons per hectare. Lethbridge has a more consistently higher yield because of our higher heat units, as well as the irrigation would help with that as well. Up to 15.4 tons. Vauxhall, similar. Elm Creek, Manitoba, even higher. So all those are higher averages as a result of more favorable growing conditions matching the corn. The silage dry matter yield of barley silage is about 10 tons per hectare. So you need about a yield of about 14 tons per hectare to make it economically viable to grow corn rather than barley, because of the higher operating costs for producing corn, as well as its increased cost of seed and greater water demand. But it will have a potentially a higher energy content than barley if you can get the starch deposition as a result of the longer growing units. So this just shows the composition of those hybrids and how they differ depending upon what their growing situation is as compared to the United States. And we can't grow corn in the prairies yet like they can grow it in the US. Their dry matter yields are typically higher, and their TDN levels are usually higher as well. Crude protein levels are similar because it's starch deposition that makes the difference. So typically the US corn grown in the US will have higher starch levels. As a result, it'll have lower fiber levels as well because it's got more starch. And the lignification, which affects cell wall digestibility, is similar in both locations. Forages also play a really important role in carbon sequestration. Cultivation or tillage will result in a disruption of the soil microbiome that's associated with the soil. That's why, and once that microbiome becomes active, then you get the breaking down of organic matter, and the atmospheric release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's why in cultivated soils, we've seen a decline in organic matter over time. We can reduce that decline by using cultivation practices like zero tillage as compared to the summer following that we used to do 30 or 40 years ago. So that can help preserve it, but none of that preserves it as much as annual forages do, and the preservation of those forages over time will result in a greater input of carbon into the soil as compared to decomposition. And of course, in grasslands, most of that carbon is below ground when you look at the roots. So if you look at a deep-rooted forage like alfalfa, it'll have a significant amount of carbon below ground in that root biomass. And of course, that then contributes to a more active soil microbiome as well, because the microbes within the soils also feed off the exudates that come from the roots themselves as well. And so those situations where we were looking at those forages contribute to increased soil health and biodiversity. And those microorganisms also are a portion of the microbes that also form microbiomes within the host animal itself, whether it be in the rumen or in other areas in the animal. Not all of them come directly from the forage, but some are transferred at birth, but there's a certain amount that do come from the broader environment. So the big objective is to optimize the digestible dry matter. So that involves the time of harvest is really critical for that. So if we look at small grain cereals, then the time for optimal harvest is usually around the soft dough stage. That's partly because if we allow it to go to maturity, at maturity, the plant cell wall digestion starts to decrease. Also, if you look at the grain kernels themselves, they also become less digestible unless they're processed by a kernel processor, because the kernels are whole and are not as readily digested as well. So it's really important that we harvest at the soft dough stage to maximize the amount of digestible dry matter. Probably the time of harvest is the factor that has the greatest impact on the yield of digestible dry matter. And that even becomes more pronounced with legumes and grasses, where early bloom or late boot is the optimal time for harvesting of those components, because the indigestible dry matter increases as the stems and that become more lignified as the crop matures. So that's one of the, for a good example would be, one of the good reflections of that is the level of risk associated with grazing alfalfa. If you graze alfalfa in the vegetative stage, where it's highly digestible, high in soluble proteins as well, you'll have a much greater risk of bloat occurring during those times because of the rapid digestion of that material. If you compare that to when it's fully mature in flour, the risk of bloat's much, much lower, but then the digestibility is also lowered as a result of that lignification. So you also get changes in composition over time as well. So as it says, so as the lignin increases, that's the factor that impacts the ability of the cellulitic microbes within the rumen to access and break down the cell wall carbohydrates, release the sugars that then are converted to volatile fatty acids to support the microbial population, and the volatile fatty acids are the major energy source that ends up being utilized by the animal. The fiber concentration, and because of that lignification, the digestibility decreases as well. And because you have increased fiber, you have a decline in protein as well with increasing maturity. So as I said, that's focusing on trying to optimize digestible dry matter by the time of harvest and growing conditions. Of course, you need fertilizer, sunlight, and water to optimize that yield as well, with the time of harvesting having a very big impact on the digestible dry matter yield that'll take place. But even once, and I think people pay a fair amount of attention to that, where they often pay less attention to is storage losses that can take place. So if you look at the amount of losses that take place during harvest, when you cut the plant, it's not, those cells don't stop metabolizing immediately. So they'll lose a certain amount of the dry matter, digestible dry matter, through respiration. Mowing and raking of dry hay will result in a further reduction of about 7%. and baling about another 5%. So you lose about 16% of the digestible dry matter just as a result of the harvesting process. And a lot of that is greater with hay because of the loss of the leaf material, which is the more digestible component of the plant. And then during storage, you might lose another 15% total with a much higher loss out of the layers on the outer part of the bales. That's going to differ a bit too, depending upon obviously how long those bales are stored for and what the climate's like where the bales are stored as well. So you can do other storage options that'll reduce that dramatically, whether you cover them with tarps or put them under covers under a roof. Some of these pyramids are that probably reduces it some, but not to the same extent as coverage with a tarp or having them under cover with a roof. Silage will result in less loss because it's harvested sooner. That doesn't wilt as long in the field. The chopping will loss about 3%, so you use less leaves, so about a 7% loss. About 11% loss if after that, if they're stored in bags, less if they're stored in upright silos, but hardly anybody's using those anymore. And then similar higher loss if they're stored in pits. Of course, that depends upon how well they're packed and the level of cover, how well they're covered, and oxygen is prevented from entering into the interacting with the silage and causing aerobic deterioration. And then you can have substantial losses during feed out as well. And often you'll see this where there's, in this case, another 15% or so that's lost during the feeding phase, which really represents a pretty significant cost considering all the work that's gone into getting the forage conserved and preserved at a point to be it's ready to fed, and then you lose it through this kind of wastage. The same with silage, it's lower, about 10%, and that's based on the feed out of the silo from the silo pit as well. So if you feed out less area and it's per weight, then the amount of dry matter loss that's going to take place as a result of aerobic deterioration is going to be greater. And if you achieve greater packing density, then the amount of dry matter loss is going to be less because oxygen doesn't enter as readily. And then the big factor that determines the digestibility then is the structure of the chemical composition of the fiber that's conserved. So that'll differ between different plant types. It differs with the maturity, like I talked about earlier, and it has to do with how the plant cell walls are structured. There's primary and secondary plant cell walls, and the degree of crystallization of the cellulose within those, with more crystalline cellulose typically being less digestible, and then the level of linkages between hemicellulose and cellulose, and the number of side groups like ferulic acid and acetylic acid can have a big impact on the digestibility of that forage, with the cross-linking and that of the linkages probably being the largest factor that impacts that digestibility. And so with greater maturity, you get greater lignification, you get less available carbohydrate in the plant cell walls. There's also less soluble sugar in more mature material as well as compared to during the vegetative stage. All of that is to feed the rumen microbiome, so primarily the bacteria, but protozoa and fungi also participate in the digestion of forages. Fungi particularly in the digestion of recalcitrant forages, so very indigestible forages like straw or other forms of forages that have low digestibility. The anaerobic fungi have a unique capacity in terms of their ability to break open plant cell walls, and so they play a greater role in the digestion of fiber that's more resistant to digestion. And protozoa as well can exhibit, they're probably responsible for about 30% of the 30 to 50% of the fiber digestion in the rumen. And then the methanogens play a role in removing the hydrogen that's produced and producing the methane that the cattle emit. So that structure of the plant material as well, which again is related to the time of harvest and to the part of the plant you're talking about, whether you talk about the leaf or the stem. Stems are typically more resistant to digestion than are the leaves. They colonize that based on the ability of the microbes to gain access particularly to the interior of the plant cell walls. So leaves have stomata, and microbes will actually access into the interior of the leaves through the stomata. In stems, they're more dependent upon damage as a result of mastication or processing or chopping of the harvest of the forage at harvest, which then provides openings in that for microbes to invade. And basically, it's a capillary action that they move into the interior of the stem and start to carry out digestion in that manner. And they form these biofilms that we call them, where there's microbes that basically share nutrients amongst themselves in order to carry out the digestion of the plant cell wall. When you deal with recalcitrant plant cell walls like barley, straw, or corn stover, ones that are that more mature, then the bacteria are unable to digest all of that plant cell wall. That's why you end up with more material in the feces, is because of that reduction in digestibility. So then we need to match the forage to the animal. So as I said, the level of protein, whether it be rumen degradable or rumen undegradable protein, and true versus non-protein nitrogen. So there can be levels, particularly in silage. We get deamination, a breakdown of protein to amino acids, and deamination, and the production of nitrogen within the silage itself during the ensiling process, and that can increase the levels of non-protein nitrogen in silage versus true protein. The energy starch is really important, and you're talking about cereal or corn silage in terms of the density of starch and its availability. That's why when I talked about the availability of starch within the kernel, that's really important for the corn as well, and that's why most people who harvest corn use a kernel processor to make that starch within the kernel more available. Plant cell wall digestibility, as I talked about already, and some forages can also have significant levels of fat as well as lipid content. And there's programs going on now to actually try to increase the energy density of forages through breeding by increasing the lipid content. And then also, depending upon the animals you're feeding, the effect of NDF or indigestible NDF and the implications that it can have. Often, if we're talking about a feedlot diet, we're really including that forage to help stimulate and maintain rumen function. And in that case, the effect of NDF or indigestible NDF composition of that forage can have a major impact on that in terms of rumination, stimulating saliva production, and preventing the development of acidosis. So that protein in the forage will also differ depending on whether it's in the kernel or whether it's in the leaf or the flower. And that non-protein nitrogen is used differently than the true protein, which is broken down into amino acids and used for microbial protein synthesis, whereas the non-protein nitrogen is broken down into ammonia, and that ammonia can then be utilized by some of the bacteria to actually synthesize the amino acids and form microbial protein. So when it comes to availability, then that provides amino acids directly to the animal that are synthesized by the microbe. And it's one of the reasons why ruminants can sustain production on diets that are not as balanced in protein or in amino acid composition as what is the case in monogastric animals. Under some conditions, they can still become deficient, though, if you're to methionine, and particularly methionine and lysine, if you're looking at situations like in the high-producing dairy cow. So maximizing the starch content is really important in the case of cereal and corn silages. In this case, they select a hybrid that's 32 to 38 during the growing season. And then there's a negative correlation that eventually the starch, once it reaches a constant level, then you start to see a reduction in whole dry matter, and starch starts to level out. And so, as I said, that those forages have a really important in terms of preventing both acute and subacute acidosis. Probably the greater cost is associated with subacute acidosis, which then has implications in the development of liver abscesses, even bloat, and potentially bovine respiratory disease. When we see these conditions develop, often it's a multifactorial type of situation, probably because of a level of compromising of the immune system of the animal, making them more susceptible to other conditions as a result of a compromised immunity. And then forages play a really important role in circular bioeconomy from the perspective of their role as croplands and grasslands. The contribution that has, there was a lot of work that was done also looking at how forages could actually be used in biorefinery, and the Department of Energy in the United States did a lot of work trying to basically derive sugars from forages as a method of ethanol production. And a lot of the science that came out of that was also applied at looking at using enzymes as a way of improving the digestibility of recalcitrant forages by ruminants as well. So we need to keep in mind about how those forages fit in and the role that they play within livestock production, but also within soil health, carbon sequestration, and the systems of biodiversity as well. So forage quality has far-reaching effects. If we end up with a lower quality forage, the animals will end up producing more methane as a result as well. We have to use more fertilizer to produce that same quantity of forage. If our yields are not as high, so we end up with more nitrous oxide being emitted as well. If we're dealing with a higher quality forage, then we have less nitrous oxide being produced and more reduction in methane, because of with higher quality forages, there's more propionate produced in the rumen, which reduces the amount of methane that's produced, and more of that material is digested and caught and captured by the animal. We also need less water. We'll produce less manure, so we have less emissions associated with the production of that manure. And we end up with greater productivity in the animal as well, in terms of more meat and milk being produced at the end of the day. So there's lots of reasons to make sure you're producing high quality forage when you're growing it out in the field and when you harvest it, and then conserving that forage as it makes its way from the field to the animal. So I just want to recognize my research team that I have that's working in Lethbridge. And thank you very much. And I'd be happy to have any questions. And they don't just have to stick to what I talked about today. We can cover other aspects too if there's other questions in terms of nutrition and how we use forages in beef cattle production systems.
Thanks, Tim. Just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, to pop them into the webinar chat or into the Q&A, and Tim would be happy to talk to you about your questions. Tim, when I listen to you speak, I'm, it depends on the topic, but I'm forever reminded of how we have, the role of our cattle or bison on the landscape as an ecosystem, and then the ecosystem within the animal on the landscape, and then the soil as well. I think it's that science has sure come.
Yeah, and I think, we're only beginning to understand the interactions. Like 10 years ago, we didn't have the tools to even study that, and from a microbiome perspective, but now we're getting that, and the interactions that we see, like the manure that we talked about, the impact that has on soil quality and the soil microbiome as well, and the long-term health. And I think in some of our agricultural systems, as they developed over time, and we've had separation from intensive livestock systems and intensive cropping systems, we've sort of lost that connectivity. And we know that, moving towards reestablishing that will be certainly having a positive effect on soil health and biodiversity.
Well, and I think too, you could even maybe extend that even a little bit further in terms of the quality of what's produced on that land, right? If you have a soil microbiome, the quality of your forage or your cattle or your grain.
That's right. And like the forage itself too, like is where we can, it's still our most efficient and economical form of carbon sequestration that we have. We hear about all this carbon storage, that they're talking about all the time in the oil industry that they're going to do. none of those are as economically competitive as just straight photosynthesis. And so anything we can do to keep those forages productive throughout the entire growing season, that's one of the advantages of corn. And one of the reasons why corn will have a higher yield is because we typically grow it for the full growing season, right till frost is often when we're harvesting. So it's capturing that carbon throughout the entire growing season.
Well, and I think too, we do have a question, so I'll ask and I'll get right to that. But I think too, like along the lines of grazing, when you have cattle that come through and graze, then you revitalize, as long as you haven't taken it down to the dirt, you revitalize that potential with that pasture, and it starts to grow back again, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So we do have a couple questions. What are your thoughts on bale grazing versus swath grazing, and which one would be more efficient?
So that's going to depend a lot on a number of different factors. So swath grazing is an efficient process in terms of the amount of effort that has to go in terms of preservation of the forage, and that is less. Basically, you just need to cut and form the swaths, right? You don't have to worry about baling or moving the bales and all of that part of the equation. So there's advantages there, but it also depends on the environment that you're dealing with. Like, what's the snow depth? How easy can the cattle access that material? In terms of if there's an icy crust over the top of the snow that's restricting access. How quickly can the cattle get to that, and to what degree is that swath exposed to other environmental conditions, whether it be moisture or heat? If it's later if we have a warm, wet fall, and that starts to promote sprouting of that material, and that can have issues as well. So you need to kind of balance those things and pick them. What's the best situation? Of course, weather's going to play a role in that as well. Those environmental concerns in terms of potential deterioration because of weather conditions can be reduced by using bale grazing, because you've got that forage in a conserved form that can basically wait out the conditions until they're more favorable. Where you'll have potential losses in bale grazing is that wastage that I talked about, where depending upon what kind of access the animals have to those bales, and how restricted that is, and their ability, to start to use those bales as bedding rather than as feed, can have an impact as well. So it's going to be unique to each situation. The density of animals you turn into those bales is going to impact that too, because what's the competition? How quickly is it consumed? Fewer animals, longer exposure times to the cattle in terms of the time it takes for them to consume that material, the more likely they are to have greater wastage as well. So it's really an individual decision based on some of those factors for consideration.
And Aspen, we have a couple of one of our partners in the Living Lab is Canfax, and they actually have done a couple of case studies for us. And so we do have one on bale grazing, and we also have one on swath grazing that looks at some of the economics and some of the practices around that. And they're on our website, agrisystemsll.ca/case studies. So that's a good one to have a look at both of those. And then, Tim, to challenge you just a tiny bit as someone who has done bale grazing on my own property, is it really waste, or is it actually the hay or the straw that they've dug and bedded in?
Well, it depends on, like,
it really waste?
It depends on the quality, right? Depends on the quality that you're dealing with. It's not like it disappears. So the carbon can go back into the soil again.
Yeah.
And the manure as well, right? For instance, associated with that. So, yeah. So it depends on, I guess if you take it for its feed value, is it providing direct energy to the animal? Then it would be considered a waste, but the carbon's not disappearing. So,
well, I think too, for myself, and I know a couple of our producers in the Living Lab have noticed it as well. The increased soil organic matter from the outsides of those bales holds a lot more moisture for the soil, and so you can actually see a significant increase in the biomass produced around those bale grazing sites, just because of the active carbon.
And probably the urination and the defecation around there helps as a nitrogen source at the same time. Yeah, definitely. Where that's really interesting is actually in Africa, where they have they basically put up these fenced areas and then move all the livestock into those areas during the evening to prevent them from being predation. And those areas will also become very rich, productive areas after they're as they move those sites from site to site. So it's a larger version of the bale grazing. Yes, that's right.
We have another question from Ray. He says, well done and thank you for your evening time. Does it, it makes me need to revisit my animal physiology days and match better with my forage production time. Product production and the end use and the circulatory comments well said. Thanks, Ray. Tim, I wonder if you have, and again, a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. One thing I had heard, Tim, because I know we do a lot of forage exports here in Alberta, that the concept of exporting forages is that we're actually exporting water to countries, you know, where we're exporting to Japan or to Saudi Arabia. It's actually, you know, we're exporting water production. What do you think about that, Tim?
Well, I don't think I agree with that completely. Like, you know, we export grain as well. It takes water to produce all of the forage or grain commodities or the canola that we produce, right? So, and often, you know, when we talk about water, we classify water into three different categories. It's green water, which is basically rainwater, which would fall on the land regardless of whether we were harvesting anything or any animals that we were growing there were present, right? So then there's the blue water, which is the water that we're pulling out of wells or the water that we're using in irrigation, of which there is some investment in order to derive that water, right? It's just not falling directly out of the sky. And then there's the gray water, which we use for deposition of pollutants. So the waste waters that are coming off of our, like the catch basin that's coming out of our feedlots, or the water that we use for washing dairies and that. So that's the gray water. So most of the forage, you know, there is a certain amount that is irrigated. I don't think it's the majority of the acreage that's irrigated forage. So most of the forage is produced with green water in Canada, and that's what's being exported. I was involved with the FAO when they started developing some of those water footprints that they were assigning to animals. And when they were originally making those calculations, you know, these were people that were more hydrologists. They weren't animal scientists. And they were doing those calculations based that if there was a cow in a quarter section of land and a rainstorm came over, they assigned all of that water to the cow that was there eating the forage. So I was able to convince them to change that approach to only assigning the amount of water that was associated with the growing of the forage that the cow ate, not all the forage that grew in the entire quarter section. So
Perfect.
So that had quite a big difference in the footprint that was associated with.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, Tim. I want to take a minute to thank you so much again for spending your evening with us, as Ray said, and sharing your expertise. And if anyone has any burning questions that they wake up with in the middle of the night, feel free to send them to me and I can pass them on to Tim. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Have a good evening. Yeah. Bye-bye.